Welcome back, everyone. I think that was an accident. We will be getting started again soon. No worries. We'll just give everyone a minute to find their way back here. All right, welcome everyone. So welcome to this session on how to start a revolution. I'm Simine Vazire. I'm the chair of this session. And I want to start with the land acknowledgement to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on. I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I encourage you to reflect on the indigenous people of the land you're on. And I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging of the indigenous people of the land I am on. The session today has a bit of a different format than many of the other sessions. Instead of presentations, we're going to focus on discussion. And so what we'll do is we'll just launch straight into a panel discussion where I will present some questions to the panel. We'll go around and answer those questions, reflect on each other's remarks. We'll do that for about the first half of the session, so 45 minutes or so. And then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Of course, you should feel free to put your questions in the chat at any time. We may not get to the questions in the chat until we start the second half of the session, unless they're kind of a very directly related question to what we're discussing at the moment, but we will get to them in the second half. So instead of me introducing each speaker, presenter, panelist, I thought I would turn it over to them to introduce themselves so that they could give not just some general background information about kind of their discipline and background, but also some information relevant to what they're bringing to this conversation about how to start a revolution. And so just as to kind of orient us around what this topic means, how to start a revolution in your discipline. One of the things that brings people together at AIMOS, even though we work across very many different disciplines, many different methods, many different kind of approaches to doing meta research, is this desire to study and or improve how things are done in different disciplines. And so I wanted to take this opportunity at this conference to have a kind of lively discussion about the challenges that people who have been trailblazers in their respective disciplines have faced, the lessons they've learned, so that we can hope to kind of learn from each other, try to skip some of the kind of dead ends that others might have experienced and benefit from each other's experience, wisdom, and so on. So I think that we'll get a really great range of perspectives here with people from different disciplines, different career stages, different parts of the world, different roles in their respective fields. So we'll start with just brief introductions from each of the panelists, and then we'll launch into the questions. So I will go in the order of our shared document that we were using before. So Dorothy, I'll start with you if that sounds good.
Yeah, hello, good morning. I've got my special Australian mug.
Great.
And it's lovely to be here. It's good evening, I know, to you. I'm Dorothy Bishop, and my background is in psychology, specifically neuropsychology. So I have spent most of my career working on understanding children's language disorders. I got interested in problems with science a long time ago, going way, way back. So I've been doing research since the 1970s. And in the early days, people weren't talking about it much, but there were really issues, nevertheless, very obvious. And I think I would regard myself as somebody who was had an early awareness of things like p-hacking, because I was working in fields where it was clearly happening, because you had such flexibility in how you might analyze things. And I was an early sort of attempter at simulations, so I was able to demonstrate to myself what a problem this was. But that was all in the 1980s, 1990s. And then really what happened was, I guess people started in psychology noticing that there were problems, and I sort of thinking, yeah, this is good that people are beginning to realize this. And around the same time, I was asked to chair a symposium at the Academy of Medical Sciences who were running a symposium on biomedical science, which was not so much my area, but concerns about reproducibility and replicability in biomedical science. And that was a real eye-opener because they brought together a lot of different constituencies, not just biomedical scientists, but people working in industry, and journalists and all sorts of people working for charities. And there were a big discussion about causes of the problems and what the solutions might be. And we did a big diagram in the end that sort of made it clear there's no one cause, there's no one solution. But following on from that, Marcus Manafo, Chris Chambers and I had all been at that meeting, and we thought one of the things that was needed was better training. And we finagled and got some money to run a training course, an annual training course on advanced methods for reproducible science, which we did for 4 years with early career researchers. And then those early career researchers were brilliant because they, it wasn't just us handing down knowledge to them. They were coming back with ideas of how to change things. In Oxford, we started the Reproducibility Journal Club, the first one, started discussing what could be done to change the university. And I have to say, without this sort of enthusiasm from grassroots early career researchers, I think things would just not have moved forward. We ended up forming Reproducible Research Oxford. Laura Fortunato, an social anthropologist, was very instrumental in that, as well as all these early career people who were fantastic. Then Marcus and others started UK Reproducibility Network, which was bringing together all the UK people interested in this. And we were now sort of hub of them. So this has all happened in really just a few years. And I'm aware that if you're quite young and starting out, things still seem to be going far too slowly because your career is really needing things to change fast. But I have to say, I feel amazed and optimistic on the basis of what has been achieved so far. And I'm sorry that's a rather long introduction, but it's been quite an interesting history for me. I never planned my life, things just sort of happen. But I'm really pleased that I think we now do have an opportunity for improving science. And as long as we keep that as our main goal, there's really plenty of potential because there's just so much excitement and enthusiasm out there.
Oh, that's great. And in retrospect, I probably should have encouraged you to spend more time on the introductions because really the audience understanding where you're coming from and what steps you've taken or what you've tried is really important. So feel free to bring that in more, of course, in the rest of the discussion. So Emily, we'll turn over to you next.
Hi, thank you for including me in this. I'm in great company, so I feel quite honoured to be here. So my name's Emily Sena. I'm based at the University of Edinburgh in a very, very cold Scotland, 0 degrees this morning. So I guess my background is in pharmacology and neuroscience. And I describe myself, I guess, as a preclinical meta-research scientist. So I'm interested in the modelling of human diseases in the lab. And I guess I kind of came into this work doing systematic reviews of preclinical research to try and understand or to make better decisions about drugs we should take forward to clinical trials. And this was in the context of stroke. I actually spent a lot of my PhD in Melbourne. I did an exchange at the University of Melbourne. And then quite quickly, it became apparent that you couldn't take the animal data on face value and say, okay, this looks like it's effective because of poor reporting, limitations in experimental design, etc. So then I guess the focus changed a bit into let's try and understand the limitations in terms of the modelling of stroke. But obviously these issues aren't related just to stroke, and then it became apparent these are issues related to the modelling of lots of different diseases. So I kind of made my business in broad preclinical meta-research. And then I guess in this kind of revolution space, I fit into the enabling category. My friends have often accused me of being an enabler, but in this context, I try and use it for good. I'm editor-in-chief of BMJ Open Science, which was the first preclinical journal under the BMJ series, and that was an opportunity to try and create a platform to support the preclinical research community in addressing some of the issues around rigor and robustness of studies. I'm also convener of the Camarades group, which is so Camarades, I always get it wrong. It's a collaborative approach to meta-analysis and review of animal data from experimental studies. I think that's what it stands for. And again, this was trying to support the community, the preclinical research community, in taking a systematic approach to understand the limitations in terms of the validity and reporting of animal studies, and then using existing data to inform decisions moving forward. And I think, like Dorothy said, there's been lots of activity and grassroots activity that I've got involved in. So the course that Dorothy spoke about, that she led with Marcus and Chris, I also teach on that course. And that, I agree, has been a great initiative. It's allowed me to meet with early career researchers from across different disciplines they've been actually got involved in some research projects, but also to understand challenges that they face, support them in some of the conversations and difficulties that they've had back in their labs. I think that's been quite a common theme in this space. So trying to provide support and engagement in their activities. But I think, as Dorothy said, I think there's a lot of movement. I mean, I've been not quite as far back as the 70s, but I think it's coming on to 15 years or so that I've been in this space. And, you know, when I started meta research, it didn't have a title, it didn't have a name. I was like, I do systematic reviews, but, you know, there wasn't quite a terminology to describe exactly what we're trying to achieve. And I think that's changed. We've got, like I say, a community, and things moving in the right direction, definitely.
Great, thanks so much, Emily. And we'll turn it over to you, Malika.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the invitation, Simine. So my name is Malika Ihle. So formally, I'm a biologist who studied the evolution of animal behavior. And in that capacity, I guess if we talk about history a little bit of where I'm coming from, I think out of frustration for the lack of reliability of my field, similar to Dorothy with her experience in psychologies. In 2016, I've organized a symposium at the major conference of my discipline, and to introduce kind of formally for the first time open research practices to people in my field. And at that symposium, we were, I think, 25 or 30. And most of the people who did not attend were thinking this was about open access and this is going to be a boring symposium. And in December 2020, I co-founded the Society for Open, Reliable, and Transparent Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, or SORT. And we organized our first conference this summer. And we were, and it was very rushed and not necessarily advertised as much as we could have if it was planned like a year ahead. And we had like 800 people registering and a lot of people attending and engaging. So I think, yeah, like in the last 5 years, I could see also that huge shift of people interest and realizing the importance of those new practices that we're trying to promote. And for the last 2 years, I have been working now full-time as the coordinator of Reproducible Research Oxford, which Dorothy co-founded. And that is a researcher-led initiative promoting open research practices across disciplines at the University of Oxford.
Great, thank you so much. And I swear that when I reached out to each of these panelists, I did not know the deep connections they have with each other. I heard of them or knew them independently of each other and did not realize these deep connections. So maybe Adrian's about to tell me that he's been, you know, some long collaboration with all three of them. We'll see. Go ahead, Adrian.
No, I'm aware of their work and admire them, but yeah. So my name's Adrian Barnett and I'm a statistician. I've been a statistician for 25 years. I was lucky enough to start my career straight out of university, and my first job was for a big drug company. And that was very formative for me because they gave me great training. We used carefully documented code, we replicated everything, and we used blinding analysis. So moving from there to my first academic job was a bit of a shock in how sloppy things were. And that was in the 1990s. So like Dorothy, I've been worried about this for a while. And I think I've been in shock ever since. And I've been trying to make academia more like a drug company ever since then, which may sound very odd to some people, given the reputation of drug companies. So that would be my revolution, or maybe a counter-revolution.
Great, thanks so much. And again, feel free to bring in your experiences and concrete examples in what we talk about. So we'll turn to our first question. And the first question on our agenda is, what are the pros and cons of trying to work within existing institutions versus creating new ones? And maybe as I read this question, I think that, another thing to think about is, what are the different ways that you can try to promote change, and how do they fall into this kind of working within versus trying to create new institutions? I feel like we skipped maybe an important step of, what are the different ways to try to start a revolution, and then maybe focusing on the pros and cons of trying to change existing systems versus create new ones. So I'll let whoever wants to jump in go for it. And don't wait for me to call on you. Feel free to just have a conversation.
I'm happy to just kick the ball off, if you like. I think you need both. So I think that quite a lot of initiatives which were well-intentioned by institutions failed precisely because they didn't have buy-in from grassroots people. So they would impose training or, other things, and nobody would go. But on the other hand, I think, you can get lots of buy-in and enthusiasm from grassroots people, but at the end of the day, we have to change the big institutions. So it's a case of having a sort of to and fro between them both. And I think I see it as quite a serious battle to get institutions on side, but I would say it's very different for the different types of institutions. So you've got things like publishers and journals who I do see, I'm afraid, very much most of the time as the enemy, and because they're really primarily there as a business profiting from scientific writing, and they've been making very huge profits in most cases. So this is not true of all of them, but I don't really trust them to change unless they are sort of forced to change by the fact that the people using their products will demand change. If you then look at academic institutions like universities and so on, they are mostly, I would say, benign, and it will depend on your institution. The problem is that they are, they basically, although they are not in it as big business, they have to keep themselves going, and they've been increasingly forced to behave like businesses because of financial pressures. And so sometimes I think they may lose their vision of what a university or whatever is all about. This is not, I hasten to say, true for Oxford University, which of course is wonderfully interested in academic matters and indeed has been very supportive of what we're trying to do, but they need money. One source of money, of course, is funding from research. And to my mind, the funders are the people you really can make progress with, because it's in their interest that research is reliable, reproducible, all the rest of it. And they have, in the UK, Wellcome Trust have been very able to make changes because they're independent of government and have really been pushing a lot of the boundaries. So, and they employed me for a while, so I know how they operate. But they are very keen to start changing the culture, as well as changing the sorts of things that people applying for grants have to do. And I think if you can make the case to them that the current system is hugely wasteful and that they're spending a lot of money on stuff that is really just not, it may even be worse than useless. It may be actively misleading people and wasting people's time trying to explore things that don't work. So I think the funders are absolutely key. And I remember, I think the first time I really realized this was I was at a meeting where they had funders talking about these issues, and one of them was a very small charity that could fund perhaps 5 projects in a year. And they said how appalling it was for them that they would get people, gathering money on, street corners, shaking tins, and then find that the research that they'd funded for some children's disease or something was completely hopeless and wasted. So they became, some of the charitable funders were amongst the first to really pick up on the need for tightening things up. So I think we need, a pincer movement from both ends. But I think the funders, if you're talking about institutions, they're the ones to really target your attention on, because if they change and make demands for changes how people operate, then institutions have to follow because they want the money from the funders.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Dorothy. I think, and I think I spoke about this when I came to speak at your seminar series in Oxford, that it's important for us to remember that, yes, there's these different stakeholders who have different roles and different powers, but also there's lots of people like us who wear different hats, and we support these different stakeholders. So we do have a role, you know, as academics, we peer review for funders, we sit on panels, chair panels, we peer review journal articles. And I think and it comes into this, you know, multimodal approach of, yes, these existing institutions have to change, but I think new institutions have a role in applying pressure to push that change and support that change. I sit on an advisory panel for a funder, and it's really interesting how a lot of them seem to feel like they don't have power. Like, no one ever feels that they're the ones who hold the power. Everyone feels that it's somebody else who's got the power. And I thought to some degree it's a bit of a cop-out, but also to some degree I understand where those feelings come from, especially, you know, if you're a small charity. As you know, you fund very few research studies, but you are a funder, but it's, you know, you don't necessarily have the power in the same way that, you know, the big funders, you know, the Wellcome, the, you know, NIH, UKRI can really affect, NHMRC can really affect big change. But I think that pressure is also required, which is why I think it requires both.
If I may, I completely agree with both of you, but for the younger people in the audience, who may feel, like you said, Emilia, like they lack the power to address the funders, for instance, I do think that like gathering and organizing amongst researchers with those grassroots initiatives or those societies, those new societies, it's extremely rewarding to feel like this energy, and I think that, yeah, collectively we can then as a group address those stakeholders that will be able to change those bigger institutions like university and journals ultimately. So yes, I do think, but our point of entry, I think my point of entry would be to organize with other researchers in those larger societies to then try to apply pressure. Exactly.
Well, I'll just say I had some really bad experiences with charities, actually, because I thought they would be a good target to listen to this stuff. And you know, like Dorothy's example, where, you know, they're going out getting this money through all sorts of sponsorship, and then it's going to waste. I think what happened was I was doing quite well with some of them. Then I think some of them, in fact, they told me this, they went to the researchers that they fund a lot and asked them what they thought about it. And obviously they said, no, everything's fine. So I was kind of blocked out the conversation. Well, I'll just put a plug in for Science and Technology Australia, who I really like. So they're basically the biggest lobby group for science in Australia, and they're very well politically connected. And that, you know, they did a lot of work behind the scenes, for example, recently on the whole ARC preprints debacle. So I've really enjoyed working with them because they're an awesome conduit for me to get my opinions across. So there's an existing group that I think are really good. There are also lots of existing groups that are terrible. I mean, at our university and all the universities I've been to, there are committees you can sit on and spend hours on where nothing ever changes. You know, what these people come up with. So early career researchers do come to me a lot and say, Adrian, I've been invited onto this committee, and I will always say to them, well, what does this committee actually influence? What does they actually change? Because there's just a lot of talk fests that you really need to avoid.
Great, thanks. I'm going to jump around in the questions a bit. So for the panelists, looking at the list. So I'm going to jump to the question, what are the biggest obstacles to reform? Because I think we've covered some of the strategies that you found effective and ineffective in the last question, but feel free to bring any of that in. So other than the things we've talked about already, what do you think are some of the biggest obstacles, maybe especially the ones that people might not anticipate?
Maybe I'm kind of repeating already what has been said, and I think Adrian's point about the charities going to the researchers and saying, "Oh no, but everything's fine," and I think that's, I kind of keep banging on about it, but I do think that researchers have a huge amount of influence here, because funders refer to them, journals refer to them, even institutions to a certain degree do refer to, they'll say, we're not the experts, the research community are the experts in this space. And if our peers don't value or don't see this as important, then I think it is a massive obstacle. I think it's one of the biggest obstacles, actually, because I do think that they do take direction from researchers in terms of where things are going to a certain degree.
Yeah, I'd say, one of the biggest barriers I've encountered is inertia, and it's almost sometimes the longer something has been wrong for, the harder it is to change, because they have to admit that they've been doing it wrong for all this time. The classic one is funding. There's never, ever been a randomized trial of funding. So you think of the billions of dollars we hand out every year to fund the best science, nobody's ever tested whether that is actually the best system. And that is just so deeply ironic, kind of really hypocritical as well. But we've tried for years to get funders to do it. And only the New Zealand, they're more innovative because they're smaller, but they're the only ones who've been brave enough to do it. So yeah, it's that you go in, and I think sometimes these people know there's a problem, whether it's at a journal or a funder at a university, but they're not brave enough to take it on, because, well, especially in Australia, there's a huge blame culture here. If things go wrong, somebody always gets blamed. I think Tim Harford wrote a book about this. You've got to accept that sometimes things will go wrong, but there's no appetite for that here.
I think I agree with some of the other things that have been said in terms of the it's the people who are propping up the system who, I think, often quite innocently really don't realise just how serious the problems are. That's one of the things I try and go around sort of showing people. This is where I think simulations are great, because you can sort of simulate some data and say, look, you probably are getting a very high false positive rate with the way you're doing things. Of course, nobody wants to hear that. And I think a lot of people, unfortunately, a lot of people in power, of course, have been thoroughly successful working the way that they have been working. I think there's also, even more seriously, I think there's a corrupting influence, and this is worse in some countries than others, I think, but people get rewarded for all the wrong things. We've had a lot of talk about incentives, but they get rewarded for, the flashy papers in particular, and for also for having very large grants. And it becomes an end in itself. And then you really have problems, because they lose sight of the real objective, which is to do good science. And instead of that, what you get are people who are really just working on how to get more grants, and it really is very corrupting. So I think the fact that people don't realise the seriousness of our current situation is one obstacle that we have to fight against. I think we also need to be cautious. I think it's always great to come in at the beginning of a revolution when there's the enthusiasm and the appetite, and everybody wants, to make a change. And then with anything, with a religion, with a political party or something, there will start to be factions that say we should do it this way, we should do it that way. And we've got to be very careful, I think, to always, amongst those of us who really are motivated to improve science, to avoid too much factionalization and splitting off, because I think that's what happens to everything as the next step. So keep eye on the sort of main goal, and if necessary, accept that different people want to work different ways, but don't try and sort of say there's only one right way.
So I feel like we've covered a lot of the ultimate causes, the ultimate reason for those barriers. I perhaps wanted to mention some proximate reason. For instance, the inertia due to social learning from PhD student learning mostly and being influenced the most by their PI. even if they see like an extremely good seminar, they will still come home and be influenced by the practice of their team. So I'm suggesting here that all those grassroots initiatives, they do realize the importance of acting as support network for those early career researchers, but also, and that's something I haven't done, I think, that I haven't realized before when I started my job at Oxford. So we need to involve the PI in those training as much as possible, also to mitigate the fact that perhaps people don't realize, the people in power don't realize the importance of these problems.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, and I think that sometimes there's this paradox in the early days of revolution where you try to just bring up, concrete points that are relatively uncontroversial and bring people along that way. But people work out that, well, if that's true, if you're saying this common research practice, has these problems and we should do it this other way instead, we should take these precautions. If it's true that this very common research practice is problematic, then that calls into question everything, this whole literature. And you're sitting there thinking, yeah, but to them, that's a counter argument, right? That's an argument that, well, what you're saying can't possibly be true because what follows from that is just way too big to, in some ways, like when the people make the connection to the more ultimate causes and the more, it can actually harm progress, because I think for some people that's just a non-starter. Just if what you're asking me to believe would lead me to this conclusion that I have to doubt everything, I have to doubt a lot of things that I had been taking for granted, then I'm not willing to accept the smaller claim, even if you have a really airtight argument for that smaller claim. I think that can be a common experience in the early days of trying to bring these issues to light. You end up having these conversations where it almost feels like, I don't know, it's weird because the logic goes out the window, right? The argument is that it can't be true because it would have all these big implications. When what I'm thinking is it's because it would have all these big implications that we have to take seriously the evidence that it is true. So I think it's really interesting, this issue of like focusing on the narrower, individual lab practices. And in a way you could make more progress if you get people to just think about their own practices in their own lab and not what that means about the literature they're reading and the practices that everyone in the other labs are engaging in. But of course, in some ways, it's really useful to make the connection to the bigger picture, because then it shows what urgency there is for this problem and how broad the scope of the problem might be. Yeah, there's some great questions in the chat that I'm hoping we'll get to, but I want to at least take time to get to one more question before we open it up, and we can also get to more of them later if there's time. But one that I want to jump to make sure we address is, how do we promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in science reform?
Oh, I can jump in to start. So I think this is really important, and I didn't say in my introduction that I do have a DEI role in the university. I convene our race equality and anti-racist committee that's essentially in charge of implementing a race equality action plan within the institution. And I've been involved in that work quite a lot, and then obviously I've been involved in meta research work for a number of years as well. And it's only in recent years that I started to see these two things coming together and thinking about the intersection of these two different types of activity. I personally believe that I think we've missed an opportunity to really embed diversity, equity, and inclusion in meta research and science reform. I think it's not something that is passive, and I think that's just because of how academia works in itself. I think there's lots of evidence that shows the lack of equality and inclusion already in our systems, and unless we make an active consideration about this, it will follow, I think, similar to other disciplines. In terms of how we do it, I guess, like I say, I think it's very early on, including these in our decisions, being active about who we include in our conversations, thinking about, similar to other disciplines, I think at the moment there's very much a kind of global north. I guess they're the loudest voices, they're the most powerful voices, they're the most influential voices. And I don't think we've made a conscious effort to include, for example, people in the global south. I mean, academia is very white dominated. It's, in the Western world, it's very male dominated in terms of people who are in power. I think it's great that, we've got people like Dorothy who are very successful leaders in this space. But I think we need more of that, and we need to make an active choice. And there's already, I think Dorothy spoke about factions, and I think that's what you're already starting to get that sense. Terminology like broken science, that's something that's already creeping in. And I think it's that kind of old school divide and conquer. If we allow that to infiltrate this space, it's going to distract us from actually doing things that I think will reform science. I don't know if it really answers the question specifically. And I don't, we've not worked out. Yes,
can I ask you, Emily, because I think what worries me is that we know that the sort of people who've been, the grassroots activists are in many ways the most vulnerable, because they're the people who don't, have the security. This is one reason why I feel I should speak out, because I can do what I like, and I'm not vulnerable. But I always feel a little bit we're sort of encouraging people who are in a vulnerable position to go against the grain. And if you start saying that as well to people who are even more vulnerable because they're, an ethnic minority, or they're female, or intersection between the two, such as you. Now, there's already these concerns that with EDI work, people who are already overworked and having difficulties get lumbered with it all, precisely because, you don't want to sort of get other people to tell them what to do. But on the other hand, you must feel this sort of conflict between wanting to promote these things, I guess, but on the other hand, you have to do the extra work yourself. And I'm a little bit worried. Well, it's not so much I'm a little bit worried, but I just wonder if there's any solution to this other than just saying, we need to be aware that this is an extra burden for people who are already vulnerable.
Well, I don't think it should be the work of marginalised people. I think that's part of the issue, is that it's something that, so in Edinburgh, so in the UK, we've got this Athena Swan initiative, which is essentially around promoting gender equality in academia. And a lot of Athena Swan committees and people and it's a huge administrative burden, and it's generally been women who've been doing it. And there's been a big push, at least in our college and the university, for male colleagues. There's no reason why men shouldn't be doing this work. It's of benefit to them in the same way that I think it's of benefit to women in terms of spreading this burden. And that seems to have, it's worked. Our new leads are 2 men. I don't think the work should happen for people without including people who these things affect. But I don't think it should entirely fall on the shoulders of marginalised people, which I think traditionally it has done. In the committees I sit on around this in the university, it's overly weighed by women. There's so many more women who are doing this work, and I guess that's part of how we do it. And I think part of the reason that some people, people who are white don't feel like they don't quite know how to get involved in issues around racial equity, and men maybe sometimes don't feel quite right getting involved in issues around gender equality. And there's lots of different marginalised groups that we need to consider. But I think there are lots of people who think these things are important, and I think we need to create a space where we say it's appropriate for you to be involved, you have a responsibility to be involved, and enable them to be involved. Because otherwise, you're putting far too much labour on people who, like you say, are already vulnerable.
And it strikes me that the UK has shown a great example of how to take steps towards this by having funded positions for people doing some work in space of open science and things like that, so that the people who are asked to do the work are not just taking on responsibility, they're also being compensated for it. And so that makes it, I think, a little bit easier to invite and for people to come in who are already dealing with other disadvantages. We're not asking them to take on another burden on top of that. If it's a funded position, if it's rewarded in promotions and so on. So I think the steps that formal organizations are taking to try to create these positions in a way that recognizes their value could help with that.
For sure. I'm not sure universities have quite done that yet. I think, although recently our promotions materials have changed and they recognise science citizenship more so, but I think this work is grossly under-resourced, which slows these things down, definitely.
Well, I'll just say, just on that point, one thing that constantly annoys me here, that the NHMRC, which is like the UK MRC, they have a research committee, and it's like 30 or 40 of the most decorated scientists in the country. And they're the ones who get asked all these questions. And they're the ones, are trying to ask questions about what's it like to be an early career researcher. But there's a tremendous survivor bias in there. We really need some of these big important committees to get far more representative of age, of gender, of race. And I mean, I do take Dorothy and Emily's point about the burden, but get multiple people on there so there's a burden shared. Because I just think the advice these committees are giving is, it's this topic we've touched on before. It's the status quo. Do things need to change? No, everything's excellent because I'm here and I'm excellent.
So I wanted to add perhaps a link to the previous question on the pros and cons of existing versus new organization. From my limited experience, I think I've been very much impressed by some of the grassroots initiative and communities that have emerged, because I think with the science reform movement, I think it's been an opportunity to start afresh and for people to engage in a system that they could build from the start. So I think it's hard to change like old and existing institution, because the people that have been traditionally excluded, it is not a system that they build or that was designed for them. But when we start afresh with those new societies, I've seen very good example of communities that created new ways of working that were inclusive from the start, and I think overall it's a good time and context to be inclusive from the start when starting those grassroots initiatives. So I wanted to add that positive note.
Great, yeah, thank you for that. So we're right on the time mark where we said we would turn to audience questions. We still have some questions we've prepared ahead of time, so I'll intersperse them if we have time. But I thought I would turn to, actually, one of the questions overlaps a bit with one that we had talked about, which is a question about what ways can PhD students convince their PIs about the seriousness of this problem. And there's a few kind of comments and questions along these lines of like, maybe if PhD students work together within a lab and approach their PI together, maybe that would make it harder for the PI to ignore or go against that. Is that a good idea? Or more generally, what do you see as ways that early career researchers can help bring about this change that they want to see either within their lab, or we could expand the question a bit more broadly than that. What's the role of PhD students and or early career researchers in general in this?
I mean, I've not been in that unfortunate position. I mean, again, I go back to a time when, you as a PhD student, you were largely ignored and just left to get on with whatever you did. But I think there is a sense in which this problem, it's going to vary across areas, I guess, but I think it will solve itself because there's increasingly the demand for things like open data, open scripts, and journals are beginning to sort of demand it. Funders are beginning to demand it. So it may be that if you're in an area where that's not yet the case, it's coming. But your PI is going to start, if they're not already doing those things, they're going to start to get twitchy. And you can really sell to them yourself as somebody who knows how to do those things. And you could be saying to them, look, this is coming in. We want to be ahead of the curve. You don't want to sort of do a large project and only at the end of the day to find that your top pick journal won't publish it because you haven't done things in a reproducible, transparent way. And increasingly, journals that want to be seen as top journals are bringing in such requirements. So I don't think change will happen overnight, and often you have to do it in a very slow, incremental fashion. But I think if you can really sell it to your PI as a way of modernizing without upsetting them and make it, I mean, you have to be very delicate, I'm sure, and tactful. But there's so many things as a PI that you can't do because times have changed since you were young. And this is just like another one of them. So that, like when brain imaging came in, everybody had to hire young people who knew how to do it because the senior people didn't know how to do it and were probably, their brains were getting too frozen and crusty to learn. So I think this is just another thing that they will be aware of it rumbling around in the background. And if they can be made aware of just how much it's rumbling. I mean, tomorrow I'm just by coincidence talking or being interviewed by a select committee of our government on the topic of reproducibility in science. I mean, it's sort of out there now. People are really getting interested and concerned about it. So I think ignoring it and pretending that these changes are not happening is not a good strategy for a PI, whereas if they have somebody who's prepared to sort of do it. The difficulty for the early career people is who's going to train them, because their PIs certainly aren't going to do it, but there are increasingly resources. And I know that, in the UK, UKRN is putting out resources, and I'm sure Amos has got similar goals to sort of make sure that people who want to do this stuff can link up with others who can help them make it a reality.
Just to say though, that, I mean, I agree with Dorothy. I think people are changing, but there are still some dinosaurs out there. I mean, I had a conversation with a young researcher, on a very serious research integrity issue. They'd taken it to that person's boss, they'd taken it to the university committee and got nowhere. And in the end, we talked about them leaving because it was very unhealthy for them. And so that is always still an option. And maybe when they finally leave, that dinosaur might change because they're actually a very good, very productive researcher. But
then we lose from science somebody who is exactly the sort of person you want in science.
No, yeah, just hopefully just move to another university, and they've got a fellowship so they can just, I agree. Yeah, no, Dorothy, but I think that has happened as well. We have lost good people because they look at this system and say this stinks.
Yeah, sure.
They want anything to do with it. Yeah.
Can you tell us what subject area that is, just in a very broad term?
It was in sort of the addiction area.
Oh, right. Okay. Because that's not one that I would have thought was immune to this, but yeah.
No, look, I think, and well, I tweeted about this because it was a Friday a couple of weeks ago. I had 3 different conversations from 3 different researchers from 3 different areas, all about serious research misconduct. It does feel to me like as things are getting super competitive and hyper competitive here, that actually some of these issues are coming to the fore. People are more willing to do all sorts of wrong things to get funding.
But that's exactly why a change to the incentive structure needs to come in. That what gets you in that hyper-competitive environment an edge is the fact that you've been doing open, reproducible science. And that's what we're really trying to sort of, this culture change that I mentioned that Wellcome Trust is trying to bring in, and some of our universities are trying to bring in. They're just changing the criteria against which you are evaluated. So it's not for having a string of papers in Cell, Nature and Science. It's for doing work that is transparent, open and reproducible, as well as being extremely interesting. I see in the chat that Fiona says we've all got to go to Rose O'Day's closing plenary, which is all about whether you sort of speak up or get out, basically, I think is the summary.
I think the option of changing labs is a really important one, that if the person has that option, I think that we don't talk about that enough. We talk about how to try to convince your PI, but not like when to give up on your PI. I know it's not an option for many people, but if it is, it's one worth considering.
In my teaching of final year undergraduates, I devote a bit of time actually to teaching them about things to consider when you're going to embark on a PhD, because I think one of the issues is that when you're already in the PhD, you're kind of in that battle, and I don't think there's a lot of guidance or training about working with PIs that, you know, are suitable for, in terms of your values. And I mean, the undergraduates, when I talk about, I teach fourth years, our final years, they're always shocked that this is the first time they've heard about any of these issues around reproducibility, around rigor. And then I build into this thing about, so if you're thinking about PhDs, obviously lots of them won't be thinking about PhDs, but if you are thinking about PhDs, I think it's something that's really important to consider. Because one of the things that, you know, I don't think we tell them in terms of how you select a PI. I think it's reciprocal, isn't it? PIs choose students, but I think students obviously also choose their PIs.
Maybe just a plug once more for field societies that promote open research practices. For those conferences, I think this is the pool of people you want to work with. And for this summer's conferences, there were a lot of senior researchers there. And I think for the early career researchers in the audience, I think this is what I would have done if I was still an evolutionary biologist. These are the people that I could consider apply for a postdoc with, because they engage actively in those type of practices. So I would encourage people in other disciplines to create also these society for open practices in their field, so that it gathers all the like-minded people. So you feel you have a supportive network and community, but also you have a job prospect if you want to switch lab.
I mean, I think the other thing I always say, I mean, this question comes up such a lot, but the other thing I always say is that I think it's very seductive, because people often think, well, if I just keep my head down and you know, go along with it now, once I get my own lab and I'm sort of in charge, then I can do things properly. And that is a disaster. That, as far as I'm concerned, never works. Either, I mean, it's like a pact with the devil. I mean, either you stay with the devil or you basically wreck your own mental health. And I've always said this is a mental health issue, because if you know what's right and you're sort of not doing it because you're pressured not to do it, you're going to feel bad about yourself. And it's very, very bad for you. So it is, it's a very serious issue, but I'm really glad to hear, I mean, Malika's idea, I think, is, you know, again, something that is now available in a way that perhaps it wasn't even just a few years ago. And there is strength in numbers, and there's strength in finding your community. I always recommend social media for finding your community, even though it's got this reputation as a terrible, toxic place. It's also a way of, I mean, that's where I first realized there were lots of other people out there interested in the same issues that I was, whereas previously, I mean, in my own department, I felt extremely isolated. It was not so much, there wasn't hostility, but there was just total indifference to the issues that concern me.
That leads perfectly into the next question in the chat, which is, in what ways, if at all, did you feel alienated because of your work on trying to reform or revolutionize science? And that there's this kind of paradox in trying to have a revolution against a community that you're part of. And so I wonder if anyone would be willing to speak to that. I mean, Dorothy, you just did, I think, about the feeling of isolation, and the role of social media, I think, is a really interesting thing to wrap into that too. And the role of society, grassroots societies, like what Malika was talking about.
Yeah, look, that's a great question. I've never felt it, because people have done such great science on this issue, you know, and then when there was the Lancet special issue, how many years ago was that now? You know, that was quite a few years ago. You know, you can meet these people and you can see they're having this real conflict in their mind. They're like, but there's nothing wrong. But, you know, peer review is excellent. Well, here's a peer-reviewed paper that shows there is something really badly wrong. And here's another one. And look, this one's in a good journal, and this one's from people from Harvard. So, you know, normally I don't like to use those kind of lazy cues, but with those kind of people, it does seem to work. So I've always felt that the science has got my back in here, because you know, you've seen it with your own eyes. It's no real surprise when the data backs it up. So that's what I've never felt alienated, because I've always, this is going to sound really schmaltzy, I've always felt like I'm doing the right thing for science, and that science has my back.
But you can, I think what you're saying makes sense, Adrian, but I think you can see how people could feel alienated in this space. And I think that's why I will say to people, you know, find your tribe, which is the same as what Dorothy was saying. I think there is something, because when you find others who are in the same, you know, have the same mindset and are trying to do the right thing with you, that's really supportive. In my early work in stroke research, I think one of the things that I think helped me was the fact that I had been in the lab. I had, you know, got my hands dirty doing the experiments, so also understood some of the issues on, you know, on the ground. And I think that really helped in the conversations, because there were things that went wrong, because I went in as I'd done systematic reviews first, then was in the lab, and kind of went in with this really kind of purist view of, you know, we need to do this in this really, really rigorous way. And then, yeah, on the ground, so one of the things around like blinding the outcome assessment, because I'd done the surgeries, then I couldn't do the behavioural assessment. I had to get somebody else to do it, but then they weren't obviously as invested because it wasn't their experiment, and then they forgot. So then we ended up losing some animals, and those little things that until you've actually experienced it, you don't quite understand, and then it changes how you speak to people. And then it's not like you're attacking them, but rather, like you say, Adrian, you know, the science is on your side, you're trying to do something that's good, but you're speaking to people, you're communicating in a way that is positive and helpful, rather than being, I guess, punitive, which I think then can lead to that alienation feeling, because then people will switch off to you.
Yeah, I mean, I would add, yeah, I wish I had the same experience as Adrian. I definitely had periods of alienation and doubt. Like, I just didn't have the conviction that Adrian expresses about science having my back or things like that. And I think one of the paradoxes of this, and probably this is more acute if you're earlier in your career, if you have other reasons to doubt yourself, but that part of the core value of a lot of this is skepticism and humility, and not seeing things in black and white, not being too sure about anything. And so if you're going into it with like, maybe we should consider the possibility that a lot of stuff we believed before is wrong, we also have to consider the possibility that we're wrong, right? It would be hypocritical not to keep an open mind about that. And for me, it took many, many years, and I'm not sure I've quite perfected it yet, but a huge part of the development for me was finding the balance between keeping my mind open, but not so open that I let people whose goal it is to stop these changes live rent-free in my mind. And I think finding that balance, like, you don't want to just become dogmatic and convince yourself that because what you're doing is righteous, you know, it justifies anything. But that doesn't mean you have to stay completely open to the idea that everyone else has very good reasons for everything they're doing, and they're always acting in good faith, and all. That's not true either, right? So neither of those extremes is true. And there are going to be some people who oppose things and use kind of tactics and things, you know, they use their status and their leverage to try to intimidate people trying to do reform and things like that. Those things do happen. And if you don't open, so you could go too far in either extreme. And I would find myself kind of waffling between thinking, yeah, I have science on my side and truth is on my side, and thinking, but if all these powerful people are trying this hard to stop it, then maybe, you know, I would have conversations with my family or friends outside of this who, and I appreciate their honesty, who would say, well, is it possible that you're wrong? Like, if all these people who are very senior and know, you know, have gotten all these important positions in the field are telling you that you shouldn't do this, then maybe you shouldn't do this, maybe you should listen to them. And it was really hard to find that balance of trusting my instinct if I know that something is right, versus not feeling like I'm just blindly, you know, being dogmatic and so on. And I think that can feel very alienating. And that's the kind of thing where I really think that finding the community, people that you trust to be honest with you and to give you feedback, so that you know if you go too far in one direction or the other, is really, really valuable.
Oh, I'll just quickly add, but maybe it's okay that we're all different, because I think that variance helps. You know, you've got the very comic people like James Heathers, who says really shocking stuff, but, you know, I really like his stuff. And then maybe you've got the people who are very quiet and do stuff behind the scenes and something in between. So yeah. I don't see it as a problem. I'm a bit more confident and more
no,
cautious.
not at all.
That's good.
Yeah. Yeah, and for me, like turning to people who did have the clarity in their minds was really helpful when I would start to doubt things, using them as an echo chamber, using people who are more skeptical of my views. It's important, I think, to have open communication with people who have different views on these things so that you can use those as a sounding board. There was somebody who raised their hand earlier. I would like to invite you to unmute yourself, turn on your video if you'd like, ask your question, or if anyone else wants to ask a question. Looking at the chat now, there's a few comments. There's a plug for a workshop tomorrow, The Trouble with Disciplines, where they'll be covering the sociology of science, STS, higher ed literatures about disciplines, and anticipates a lot of the issues discussed in this session. That sounds really fascinating. If we don't have more questions from the audience right now, I will go back to my list of questions. And there's one that's related to what we've just been talking about, which is the role of social media and informal networks. And Malika, I'd be curious what you think about this, because I think that Sortie and organizations like this are kind of, they start maybe from an informal network, right? And then try to formalize it. And so I'm curious what you see as the valuable informal networks. And yeah, is there a downside to formalizing? Is there value to networks that remain informal, and what did those look like? How do you plug into those? How do you find those? How do you get to the point where you could create a Sortie?
Well, so the history, I guess, it really comes back to this small group we had in early on, because out of this frustration that we didn't have a community to get support and feel like we could relate to the type of practices that we wanted to have. So like in 2016, we were like a very small number, but then I think growing informally has been very rewarding for people, like feeling like this sense of belonging and having, as I said before, like people that, oh yeah, that could be the people I can work with. And I think conferences are very good because it really provides a platform for listening to each other and be constructive and find solution collectively. I think, so social media is also is good for advertising and perhaps having a broader reach. But I do think those conferences and those more formal conferences are also a better place, I would think, to really exchange. I'm not sure about more formal, even like I don't know how more formal we can get. So I don't know, we're still in the process of thinking whether Sortie, for instance, is in a good position to advocate and to do advocacy and towards like stakeholders like funders. But this is definitely in the discussion, and we are definitely consulting the community members to know whether that should be something we should do and how we should approach that. So yeah, I think, but I know from the UK Reproducibility Network and the other panelists can speak about that more than me, that we, and with Reproducible Research Oxford, that we are now in a better position being part of those universities and so those standing organizations, that we are now in a better position to lobby with the relevant stakeholders. I think really both have their advantages.
Great, thanks. And of course, anyone feel free to jump in if you want to add anything to that or any of the previous points. We have some other questions in the chat now. So Trung asked, what does the panel think about the fact that given the vast majority of PhD graduates won't stay in academia due to the lack of job opportunities and security, how does this revolution help to address their more immediate concerns of just finding a paying job? So how can this unemployment challenge be directly addressed at the same time as the revolution?
Yeah, look, I mean, people I know who have left recently have gone into policy and have gone into drug companies. So they're still really important people to know about this because, you know, they control funding, they control practice and policy. So I think it's still useful for these people to know that. But look, it is a good point. There's still, you know, big things to learn about doing things carefully and doing things slowly, which ironically I learned at a drug company, and now people are going back the other way because they're a more steady source of employment. That's all I've got to say.
Yeah, I make very similar points that we are, in a sense, that there's no way that all PhDs are going to get a job in academia because there just aren't that many jobs in academia. And I think quite often, perhaps that's missold to people when they first come in. They just assume they're going to proceed up the ladder to be the PI at the top of the end. So I think you should go into it being aware that that might not be the final destination, but that is not a failure because of these other jobs and opportunities that really need smart people who are well trained. In addition to the sorts of things that Adrian's talking about with, going into industry, going into policy, I've had students of mine go into media, journalism, science journalism, things like that, where you really need that sort of background. So I think it's worth looking at a range of career options. But also, I would just come back to the fact that if you're well trained to look at data critically and to really sort of be your own person and try and do the best science you can, I would say in any of these positions, you should be more employable. And if you're in a sort of field that's a bit of a sewer and you're stuck in that, I'm sorry, it's really bad news. And I can only say we're all going to do our best to sort of eliminate those sorts of sub areas where it's sometimes sort of like a Harry Potter novel where Voldemort is in charge of a few of these areas, but we're going to go in with the sword of justice or whatever he uses and try and make sure that things do change. But meanwhile, I do think it's a case of really sticking to your guns and really being trying to do the best job you can as a good scientist, because most employers, that's what they want.
I also think most of the open research practices that we train people for are transferable skills, like involving, like using pro-registration. You can turn this into very good project management skills, and the computing skills for reproducible workflows are definitely prized by industries and companies, all those programming skills. So you can also, I don't think this is a wasted investment, even if you know that you won't continue in academia.
Or just to jump in with a quick anecdote, we were talking with just on Dorothy's point there, we were talking with a big medical college the other day, and they were talking about how they wanted to upskill their clinicians in research because they're repeatedly being misled by marketing dressed up as research. So that's pretty shocking. And there's a good example of how these kind of skills, even if you do a PhD and then you go back to being a doctor full time, it's still really valuable.
Great, thanks. Another question in the chat is, to Dorothy's point that funders are key to change, what can we do as individual researchers to influence funder policies?
I'm going to jump in straight away. The only time I've ever got funders to change their policy is by embarrassing them in the media. I have to say these big institutions, and it can be the same with universities as well. When bad stuff happens, they actually try and cover it up a lot of the time. So I've been told that, going to the media is the last resort and, you burn your bridges, but based on the sample size of my career, it works tremendously well.
Yeah, I would agree. But in my case, it has been more with publishers than with funders. As I say, my experiences with funders have been pretty good. I think we're perhaps lucky with the funders that we deal with. I think the other thing might be just the need for more meta research demonstrating, what they seldom do is to really do long-term follow-up of, what were the results of what they funded. And I think there could be some really quite shocking tales there. Obviously it's always going to be the way that not everything works out, but there have been sort of trendy subjects where it's gone on far too long. There's like no stop rule for funding in this area. And I know there was something written, for example, about Alzheimer's disease, and one trendy theory for Alzheimer's disease has dominated and nobody was able to get funding for anything else for years and years and years, until you've got a period of perhaps 20 years where research has really gone down what might be a false path. And I think if those people who funded that research were confronted with that and said, well, could you have had better mechanisms in place to maybe identify when something's a dead end and stop funding it and start thinking about funding other things. It's really tough, but I think there may be not enough reflection on what they funded in the past and how they've done things in the past, and perhaps some meta-research that sort of focuses on how particular funding streams have influenced the course of science would be an interesting exercise to undertake if you could get somebody to fund you to do it. The funders themselves might just be up for that, to be honest. Let's see.
Yeah, I was going to make the same point, and it kind of goes back to Adrian's point right at the beginning about research in funding. Just it has, there's never been an RCT about what works well, but meta research definitely needs to be better funded so we can derive some empirical evidence to support some of this stuff. That's what I think is missing.
I wanted to pick up on the point you made, Adrian, about embarrassing institutions as a way to affect change. And I'm curious to talk a little bit more about the pros and cons of that, and which institutions that might work with and might not, and which people doing the calling out might experience more costs and benefits and so on. And Dorothy, you mentioned that your experience is more with journals, and I found it quite striking how reluctant people are to discuss the responsibility of journals for some of the failures that happen. Very often we focus on the authors or things like that, or an individual paper, but not the pattern. Like, what is this journal doing? Even, for example, in psychology, one of the really key events in our revolution was the publication of a 100 replication paper, the Reproducibility Project Psychology. Those 100 studies that were replicated were sampled from 3 specific journals. But we hardly ever hear talk about those 3 journals or questions about what have they done. Somebody took on the work of collecting data on 100 studies with over 200 researchers participating in running these studies, analyzing them, and so on. This was a huge service to those journals. If I was running one of those journals, I would be like, wow, that's amazing that somebody did all that work to assess the validity of our studies on this one dimension of replicability, but still that's a pretty important dimension. But we don't talk about it at the journal level. Whenever we talk about those results, it's either as an aggregate or about individual studies, but very, very rarely do we say, well, have those journals done anything in response to that evidence? Or, and more generally, I find that there's not much conversation about how should this affect the reputation of that journal. And I think part of the reason, obviously, is that it's risky for people to speak out against journals that they may need to publish in, their students may need to publish in, things like that. But the same applies, Adrian, you said that you found it to be effective to embarrass funders publicly. I assume that's coming at some risk to you. These are funders that you may someday ask for money, or your colleagues or students or so on might, so making enemies out of them presumably has some costs. So how do we decide how to balance the pros and cons of this naming and shaming approach, which I think is valid at the institution level, especially for powerful institutions, but is a risky approach?
Well, sorry.
No, go on, Adrian, you go.
Just to talk about the funder, yeah, we tried to work with them. We tried to do the right thing, but they just didn't want to. And, we talked about with a lottery idea with them, and they literally laughed in our face. And Warwick Anderson made a joke at his valedictory speech about us and the idea of using a lottery. Well, I now make jokes about Warwick, making a joke about that, because the joke's on him, because there are now funders all around the world using lotteries. Warwick's gone now. So we definitely did burn some bridges, and we were shut out for a few years, but there's quite a high turnover in these places. Those people have moved on. And actually some of the work we've done, I know they've actually used and has got somewhere. So yeah, you do burn bridges, but maybe they regrow.
There's too many bridges anyway.
Yeah, and I think people do typically overestimate the risk. I feel very much as Adrian does. But I think it's down to your personality type. But I do start I get into little Twitter debates sometimes with people, because you get so often people say, oh, this journal did this, isn't it terrible? They rejected my paper for this reason. But they don't tell you which journal. They just say, Agent, this just happened to me. So I tend to tweet back saying, can you tell us who the journal is so we can avoid it in future? Too risky. And I actually find that quite often it's the opposite, that they're so scared of you in future that they're going to behave really rather more carefully if they think you might otherwise call them out. So I think we need to be perhaps a little bit braver in calling things out. If, as Adrian said, I mean, it's exactly my experience. In my case, it's been not so much specifically with journals as with publishers, because I've been concerned with cases where editors are dodgy. And so you really need the publisher to take action against dodgy editors. It's a rare thing, but when it happens, it's really serious, because the editor can, you know, really do anything. And it's exactly the same. You try and write to them and say, you know, here's a problem. And if you're lucky to get a response, and then if you get a response, they sort of very much just say, oh, yes, we'll look at it. And then you never hear from them again. I know Jennifer Burns around somewhere on here, and she's had these experiences time and time again. So I have found there that, you know, sort of social media and just sort of describing such experiences gets them more activated than they would otherwise be, because a lot of these big institutions make the terrible mistake of not being aware that social media really exists, and they really think that they can cover things up. And in this day and age, you cannot cover things up. I mean, if you're behaving in a way that's unethical, or you're failing to do what you should be doing, sooner or later somebody's going to come out and talk about it publicly. And so they really need that. They're learning that, I think, now, but they're still perhaps not aware of the extent to which people do have power on social media to draw attention to things that are really contrary to the benefit of science, which is, you know, they're the things I want to call out. I'm sick and tired of seeing the sort of bad science getting out there and staying out there that just leads other people to spend a lot of time and money trying to build on it when it's really flaky. I mean, that's my only motivation really in all of this, but I think that's serious enough to not pussyfoot about. I mean, we're not in a vicarage tea party here. We're really trying to do something serious. And I think sometimes you have to upset people.
Yeah, and I would add that in addition to social media, there's regular media too. If it's a serious case, journalists might be interested in it. If you find a journalist that you trust and has written about these kinds of issues of scientific integrity before, sometimes they are interested in writing up a particularly important case.
That's very true. But I was going to add that I think we need to be mindful about, I think it all comes down to power, and people have different levels of power. And I think calling out certain stakeholders can be very detrimental to people who aren't in positions of power. And I don't think we should underestimate that. You know, we're talking about marginalized groups before, and, you know, I don't doubt for a second that if somebody from a marginalized group tried to call out a powerful publisher or funder, that it would have huge impacts on their careers. So I agree that I think social media, and there's a power in numbers that I think can be helpful. But I think making out that, you know, individuals who maybe who are in more precarious positions, it has the potential on their own to be detrimental to them, which then kind of loops back into finding your community, finding your tribe, finding those powers in numbers, because on your own you could be, to a certain degree, quite vulnerable.
Yeah, and I would say that that's one thing that a good trusted journalist can provide to you is anonymity. So I've spoken to journalists, for example, about sexual harassment cases where the majority of the people they spoke to remained anonymous. They'd need one or two people to go on the record, but often that can be the less vulnerable people. So when there's a pattern, then you can contribute to the story about the pattern without necessarily taking a big risk yourself if there's someone else who's in a position to take that risk.
And even if in the end it turns out that, you know, at the end goal you get to where you want, there is a potential for collateral damage along the way. Yeah. And I think being mindful of that is important.
Yeah, we're getting so many great questions now. We have only 10 minutes left, so maybe we'll do a lightning round style. So I'm gonna get to Matthew's question, then we'll do Jenny's. We'll go kind of chat, raised hand, chat, raised hand. So Matthew asked about, I sometimes see consternation on social media about reform movements for one discipline trying to, quote, dictate what other disciplines should do. What do the panel think about this? Is staying in one's lane helpful or a missed opportunity?
I think you shouldn't dictate clearly, because you may not understand that other discipline, but you certainly should try and talk to them and find out what their concerns and issues are. I think when people do make those sorts of complaints, it's often the people that don't want to make changes anyway. So you really want to find the people in that discipline who may have concerns and find out what those concerns are. But it is true that sometimes a solution that would work in one discipline is not appropriate for another.
I've definitely had that. Like I said, my work started in the stroke space, but when I've done some work in pain research, and it was a completely different experience in terms of how the researchers interacted with you, how they responded to what we were doing and what we were saying, and having allies in that space made a huge difference.
So I work in statistics, so I've crossed fields all the time, and they're all bad. So I don't have this issue at all.
I would say, I think a great thing about people not staying in their lane is that sometimes outsiders can say things that people within the field feel like they can't say. And so I've really appreciated when people from adjacent fields who have enough expertise to see a problem will speak out on it. And sometimes they'll just say the thing that a lot of people have been thinking and not able to say. So that it can be very good if you're willing to do that. But yeah, you will get some blowback, I think. All right, Jenny, do you want to ask your question?
Oh, thanks, Simine. Yeah, I think I was more going to give an example just about, how, I suppose, difficult it is to sort of effect change. So in the middle of the year, we reported in a preprint 712 papers with incorrectly identified sequences published across nearly 70 journals. So now, nearly 6 months later, we've had one paper corrected, 1 out of 712. Virtually no journals. We've written to every journal. Virtually, some journals, a minority write and say, oh yeah, we'll look into this. But I tell you what, you wouldn't want your life to depend on it. So it's just, I think there's, I think I've talked to Dorothy about this, the need for, it's very, very difficult to bring journals to account. If they don't want to do something, there's very little that I think individuals can do to make them recognise that their responsibility is to publish reliable literature. Just in the spirit of a scientific conference, I thought I'd throw in a few numbers.
Yeah.
Not to sound too defensive of journals, and it's not happened with my journal, but in the kind of BMJ family, there's been quite a lot of discussions about this. One of the common things that happens is that when something's brought to a journal, it's a process that's not quite clear, and the journal will go to the institution to try and investigate, because there has to be an investigative process. And institutions are also very reluctant to support that investigation. And I think that's been quite a common theme as well. So again, it's the different stakeholders all have a role to play here. And if they're not all participating, then it's very difficult to shift things and improve things.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Jenny. It's really good to get concrete examples on the table, as depressing as they may be. It'll be interesting to get an update, in another 6 months or a year, see if any of this is just a lag or if it's as depressing as it sounds. Our next comment is from Judith, who asked, what are your thoughts on cutting in half the number of PhDs? It increases funding success rates in the future, might increase quality of supervision, and might make it easier to do slower science.
Yeah, look, I've seen a lot about this. There's been articles in this in the Australian press that, we have too many PhDs. I'd say not in my field. We struggle to find good stats PhDs. So yeah, if this is going to be cut, I hope it's done in a surgical way, that cutting those fields that are truly overserviced and directing some more people towards maths.
Great, yeah, I don't have a strong opinion one way or the other about this either. Nora, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. I guess my question is, what does the panel think about putting pressure on departments to stick strongly to open science practices as a way to protect early career researchers? And as one of them, I feel this closely and strongly, where you often get these sort of, I don't know how to call it, but schizophrenic perhaps discourse where a PI knows it's not politically correct to refuse you from engaging into open science practices. But on the other hand, they say, yes, of course you should do it, but be careful not to waste too much of your time, because what we want is X, Y, and Z outcomes. And so I think if there, I mean, this is my opinion, but I'd like to hear what the thoughts of people with much more expertise in this are. But if there was a stronger rule from the department, that will help protect it. But yeah.
So I think a rule in itself, it may not fix the problem. It comes back to a culture change and reward incentives, and the whole system needs to support and reward these activities. I mean, yeah, I think a rule on its own won't necessarily fix the problem, but having support and infrastructure, you know, that departments invest in to allow their early career researchers to do more open science, I think would help. And then how that work is evaluated and rewarded that takes into this account would also help.
Yeah, we have in the UK this research excellent framework, variously called research assessment exercise and so on. And I believe in Australia you studied something similar some years after we had decided that it probably wasn't such a good idea. But you can build incentives into that, and they do try quite hard to get this to incentivize good behaviors. And I think even in this round that we've just had, there's been more interest in what they call research environment and things like having infrastructure for open data, open science. And the word on the ground is that next time, which will be a few years away, they do this sort of evaluation, which is an evaluation of all universities in higher education institutes, I think in the UK, on which funding depends. So it's high stakes for those institutions. I think next time round, there's going to be a much bigger emphasis on getting how far your institution does do reproducible, open, transparent work, not just, you know, already they've tried very hard to get away from the publish or perish, and they limit how many papers they consider from each person so that you don't have just tons of stuff. You have to really select what you think is your best. And they do try and have other things in the environment statement about, you know, how far the institution is promote, you know, is working in the interest of ECRs and so on. So I think, I don't know if, you know, maybe this is not so true where Nora is, and I think many countries don't have this kind of thing, but that's really in line with what Emily's saying, that I don't know that at the departmental level it would make a big difference, although if you did have a highly supported department, I'm sure it couldn't do you any harm. But I think that basically institutions and departments respond to basically who controls the purse strings, and ultimately government initiatives can make a big difference there. So that's one reason why I think it's very important to consider those and to try and influence those as well as to do grassroots work.
So that might be a good note to end on. Whenever we talk about, you know, how one of the big motivators that especially early career researchers can use to justify why it's important for their lab and their advisors and mentors and stuff to engage in these practices, they can point to these gatekeepers like funders or journal editors that are journal policies that are going to require this. And so you want to do it because, you know, it's going to be an obstacle otherwise to doing your work. And that every time I hear that advice directed at early career researchers, it reinforces for me the importance of those of us in those gatekeeping roles, how important it is for us to actually follow through on that, so that that leverage is real, so that when an early career researcher says to their advisor, to their collaborators, hey, we should really consider pre-registering, we should really make our data publicly available, things like that, because that's going to be expected of us, then we have to back that up with the gatekeepers, editors, the people on the funding panel, et cetera, saying we're going to reward those papers that engage in those practices. We're going to hold accountable the ones that didn't do it, have them explain, you know, why not, or discuss the limitations of their work and so on. So I think it's kind of a carrot and stick approach. In an ideal world, I think a lot of the early career researchers can focus on the benefits of engaging in these practices for their labs, for their mentors, and the people in positions of power who are pushing for reforms can be the sticks, the side that says, yep, if you want to get past me, you're going to have to, you know, address these fundamental issues of validity, credibility, and so on. And so I think it's two sides of the same coin. we've talked a lot today about the different roles that early versus later career researchers can play. I think that we can really reinforce each other in these different roles. So I will end on that note. Hopefully it hasn't been too depressing of a session, and I want to send encouragement to everybody trying to help improve their disciplines, and for all of us to keep communicating and helping each other in those efforts. So
I think we've come a tremendous way in the past few years, and so people should feel encouraged. I mean, the change between now and 2015 is astonishing.
Yeah.
I agree. We've got tools, we've got infrastructure, we've got communities. There's been a huge movement in the right direction. Like, we're not there yet, but we're definitely going in the right direction. So I think people should be encouraged, not depressed.
So thanks for organising.
Great, thank you all. Thanks to our panelists, and thanks everyone for your questions.
Thanks everyone.